Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is experiencing unbearable pain. A parent has just lost a child. Someone has received a terminal diagnosis. A person is going through a devastating betrayal. Another is facing financial ruin through no fault of their own. And in the privacy of their suffering, almost all of them are asking the same question. Why? Why is this happening to me? What did I do to deserve this? Why would God or fate or the universe allow this? This question feels urgent, necessary, like if we could just understand the reason for our suffering, we could somehow bear it. But Viktor Frankl, who survived Nazi concentration camps and spent his career helping people navigate their darkest moments, would tell you something radical. You're asking the wrong question, and that wrong question is making your suffering worse. The question, why is this happening to me, is a dead end. It has no satisfying answer. Even if you could identify a reason, a cause, an explanation for your suffering, would it actually help? If you understood exactly why you got cancer, or why your spouse left, or why you lost your job, would the pain be less? Usually not. Often the knowledge of why makes things worse, because now you have someone or something to blame, including possibly yourself, which adds guilt and rage to the existing pain. The question, why me, keeps you stuck in the past, rehearsing what led to this moment, looking for explanations that don't exist or don't help. It positions you as a victim of circumstances, someone to whom life has done something terrible, powerless except to understand your victimhood. Frankl proposed a completely different question, one that seems small but changes everything. What now? Not why did this happen, but given that it has happened, how will I respond? What will I do with this situation? What meaning can I create from this pain? This shift from why to what now is the core of what Frankl called man's ultimate freedom, the last of the human freedoms that cannot be taken away no matter what happens to you. You cannot always control what happens to you. You absolutely cannot control what has already happened to you. But you retain, always, the freedom to choose your response, to decide what this experience will mean, to determine who you will become through it. This isn't just philosophy. This is practical wisdom born from the most extreme testing ground imaginable. In the concentration camps, Frankl observed two types of prisoners facing identical horrific circumstances. The first type became consumed by the question, why me? Why is this happening? What did I do to deserve this? They fixated on the injustice, the cruelty, the unfairness. And this focus, this constant rehearsal of victimhood, often broke them. They gave up. They lost their will to survive. The external circumstances hadn't defeated them. Their internal response to those circumstances had. The second type of prisoner asked different questions. How can I endure this? What can I hold on to that gives me reason to survive another day? How can I maintain my humanity in this inhuman place? What will I do if I survive? These prisoners weren't in denial about their circumstances. They saw the horror clearly, but they refused to let circumstances have the final word about who they were and who they would become. This distinction is everything. When you ask, why me? You're engaging with the past, with causes and reasons and explanations that don't change your present reality. When you ask, what now? You're engaging with the future, with possibilities and choices and meanings you can create. One question disempowers you. The other returns agency to you. One makes you a victim. The other makes you a protagonist in your own story. And this matters not because it changes the external facts. Your pain is still your pain. Your loss is still your loss. But because it changes your relationship to those facts. It transforms you from someone suffering meaninglessly to someone suffering meaningfully. And that difference is the difference between despair and dignity. Let me be clear about what this doesn't mean. It doesn't mean you should pretend pain isn't painful. It doesn't mean you shouldn't feel angry or sad or devastated. It doesn't mean everything happens for a reason in some cosmic plan. Frankl wasn't offering cheap comfort or spiritual platitudes. He was offering something more honest and more powerful. The recognition that while you cannot always escape suffering, you can always choose what your suffering means. You can decide whether it destroys you or deepens you. You can determine whether it makes you bitter or breaks you open into greater compassion. You can choose whether you suffer in a way that diminishes your humanity or in a way that somehow, impossibly, enlarges it. This is the freedom that even concentration camps couldn't take away. The Nazis controlled everything. what prisoners ate, where they slept, whether they lived or died. But they could not control whether prisoners maintained dignity, whether they helped fellow prisoners despite personal cost, whether they held on to their values and identity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Some prisoners became like their oppressors, brutal and selfish. Others remained profoundly human, sharing their meager bread, offering comfort, refusing to be reduced to mere survival. The external circumstances were identical. The internal response was freely chosen. And that choice, Frankl insisted, is always available no matter what you're facing. Most of us will never face anything remotely as extreme as concentration camps. Yet we often surrender this fundamental freedom far more easily than those prisoners did. We allow circumstances to dictate our internal state completely. We give our power away to situations and people, letting our well-being depend entirely on external conditions we can't control. Something bad happens, and we collapse in a victimhood, as if we have no choice but to be miserable, bitter, broken. But you do have a choice. Always. Even when you can't choose what happens to you, you can choose how you carry it, what you make of it, who you become through it. This isn't about positive thinking or looking on the bright side. Those approaches often feel false and dismissive of real pain. This is about something deeper, recognizing that pain is inevitable, but meaning is optional. You will suffer. That's guaranteed. But whether your suffering is meaningless or meaningful, whether it destroys you or transforms you, whether it's wasted or becomes the ground from which something valuable grows, that's up to you. Not always immediately, not always easily, but ultimately, the meaning of your suffering is yours to determine. The shift from why me to what now seems simple, almost too simple to be profound. But it's the difference between being imprisoned by your circumstances and being free within them. It's the difference between passive victimhood and active response. It's the difference between suffering that breaks you down and suffering that, somehow, builds you up. In the next chapter, we'll explore exactly how to make this shift, how to move from the paralysis of why to the power of what now, how to find or create meaning even in circumstances that seem meaningless. 20 minutes to reshape how you see pain. We're halfway there. If this perspective is already shifting something in how you understand your own pain and struggles, subscribe to the channel. What we're exploring here isn't just interesting. It's potentially life-changing, and we're just getting started. Understanding intellectually that you can choose your response to suffering is one thing. Actually doing it when you're in the depths of real pain is entirely different. The gap between knowing this principle and living it can feel impossibly wide when you're facing genuine anguish. So how do you actually make the shift from why me to what now when your world is falling apart? Frankl didn't leave us with just theory. He identified 3 concrete pathways through which people can find or create meaning even in the midst of suffering. And understanding these pathways gives you practical tools for transforming your relationship with pain. The first pathway is creating or accomplishing something meaningful despite your suffering. This doesn't mean your suffering itself is productive or good. Pain is not good, but you retain the capacity to create, contribute, or accomplish something valuable even while you're in pain, and that creation or contribution can give your suffering context and purpose. Frankl saw this in the camps when prisoners who had unfinished work, projects they needed to complete, manuscripts they needed to write, somehow found strength to survive that others without such purposes couldn't access. The suffering remained terrible, but it wasn't meaningless because it was the obstacle standing between them and something they needed to accomplish. Their response to what now was, I must survive to complete this work. For you, this might mean continuing to show up for your job, even while grieving, and finding meaning in the service you provide or the colleagues who depend on you. It might mean creating art from your pain, writing about your experience, using what you've learned to help others facing similar struggles. It might mean simply maintaining your daily routines and responsibilities with care and attention, refusing to let your suffering make you careless or nihilistic about the rest of your life. The key is identifying something you can do, create, or contribute that connects your present pain to future purpose. You're not suffering for no reason. You're suffering while still being someone who creates, who contributes, who accomplishes, and that matters. The second pathway is through experiencing something or someone, through love or beauty or truth or connection. Even in the midst of suffering, perhaps especially in the midst of suffering, you remain capable of deep experience. You can still love. You can still be moved by beauty. You can still connect authentically with another person. You can still be present to moments of grace or wonder or tenderness. Frankl wrote about prisoners in concentration camps who would gather at the window to watch the sunset, finding something transcendent in that beauty despite their circumstances. He wrote about maintaining his love for his wife even after learning she had died, recognizing that love itself was meaningful regardless of whether its object still existed. This pathway requires a kind of openness that suffering often makes difficult. Pain tends to close us down, to narrow our focus to our own anguish, to make us unable to see or feel anything beyond our immediate suffering. But if you can find moments, even brief ones, where you open to experience beyond your pain, where you allow yourself to be moved by beauty or touched by another's kindness or present to love, those moments create meaning that coexists with your suffering. You're not in pain instead of loving or experiencing beauty. You're in pain while still being someone who loves, who appreciates beauty, who remains open to connection. Your capacity for deep experience hasn't been destroyed by suffering. It might even be deepened by it. The third pathway, and the one most relevant when the first two seem impossible, is the meaning you create through your attitude toward unavoidable suffering. When you can no longer change your circumstances, when there's nothing you can accomplish and you feel too broken to experience beauty or connection, you still retain the freedom to choose what your suffering means. How will you bear this? With bitterness or dignity? With rage at the universe or acceptance of reality? With self-pity or courage? With isolation or openness to support? These choices don't change what's happening to you, but they profoundly change who you're becoming through what's happening to you. This is the pathway Frankl emphasized most because it's the one that's always available. You might be too ill to accomplish anything. You might be too heartbroken to experience beauty, but you can still choose your attitude. You can still decide that you will suffer in a way that honors what you value most. If you value courage, you can face your pain with courage even when you don't feel brave. If you value compassion, you can remain open and kind even when you want to close down in bitterness. If you value truth, you can be honest about your pain without dramatizing or minimizing it. The attitude you take toward your suffering is where your deepest freedom and deepest humanity reside. What makes this so powerful is that it transforms suffering from something purely negative into an opportunity, though an opportunity no one would choose. You're discovering what you're made of. You're revealing your character. You're demonstrating to yourself and anyone watching that circumstances don't have the final word about who you are. Some people crumble under much smaller challenges. Others maintain grace and dignity through unimaginable hardship. The difference isn't in the circumstances. It's in the attitude, and attitude is always chosen even when it doesn't feel like a choice. The practical application of these three pathways means that when you're in pain, after you've allowed yourself to feel it fully without resistance, you ask three questions. First, is there anything I can do, create, or contribute despite this pain? Is there work that still needs doing, people who still need me, purposes I can still serve? Second, can I remain open to love, beauty, connection, experience even while I hurt? Can I notice the sunset, accept a friend's comfort, feel gratitude for what remains even as I grieve what's lost? Third, how will I carry this suffering? What attitude will I choose toward what I cannot change? Who will I be in the midst of this pain? These questions move you from passive victimhood to active response. They don't eliminate your pain, but they transform it from meaningless suffering into meaningful challenge. You're not just enduring. You're creating, experiencing, choosing. You're exercising the fundamental human freedom that nothing can take from you. And in that exercise of freedom, in that choice of response, you discover that while suffering is inevitable, despair is optional, pain is unavoidable, but meaninglessness is a choice, though usually an unconscious one. You can choose differently. You can suffer meaningfully, and meaningful suffering, while still difficult, is categorically different from meaningless suffering. The difference between these two types of suffering is the difference between a burden that crushes you and a burden that somehow, mysteriously, strengthens you. Same weight, different meaning. In our final chapter, we'll explore what happens when you fully embrace this perspective, when you integrate it not just intellectually, but as a lived reality, when you become someone who responds to pain by asking, "What now?" instead of "Why me?" The transformation that results isn't just about suffering better. It's about living more fully, more freely, more humanly. If these practical pathways are giving you tools you can actually use in your own struggles, subscribe to the channel. We're not just talking about ideas here. We're exploring ways of being that can change everything about how you experience your life, especially the difficult parts. 20 minutes ago, you began reading with one understanding of pain. If you stayed with me through these ideas, something has shifted, not because I've told you anything that eliminates suffering or makes it less real, but because you're beginning to see that you have power in places you thought you were powerless. The question now is what you do with this understanding. Does it remain an interesting intellectual idea, or does it become the foundation of how you actually live, especially in your hardest moments? The difference between knowing these principles and embodying them is the difference between reading about freedom and actually being free. Frankl spent the rest of his life after the camps helping people make exactly this transition from understanding to embodiment. He worked with patients suffering from depression, anxiety, addiction, and what he called the existential vacuum, that sense of inner emptiness that no amount of pleasure or success can fill. What he discovered was that many people were suffering not primarily from their circumstances, but from their belief that they had no choice about how to respond to their circumstances. They felt trapped, powerless, victimized by life. And in that perceived powerlessness, even relatively minor difficulties became unbearable. The solution wasn't to change their circumstances, though sometimes that helped. The solution was to help them recognize the freedom they'd never lost, the capacity to choose their attitude and response that remained intact regardless of what was happening to them. This recognition, when it fully lands, is transformative. You realize that you've been giving away power you didn't need to surrender. You've been allowing circumstances to dictate your internal state completely, as if you had no choice. Someone treats you badly, and you automatically become bitter. Something doesn't go your way, and you automatically become despairing. You experience loss, and you automatically become a victim defined entirely by that loss. But these responses, while understandable, aren't inevitable. They're chosen, even if the choice is unconscious. And if they're chosen, they can be chosen differently. This doesn't mean you can choose your feelings directly. You can't simply decide not to feel sad when something sad happens. Emotions arise automatically based on circumstances and interpretation. But you can choose what you do with those feelings, how you relate to them, whether you let them define your entire existence, or whether you experience them as part of your experience, while maintaining a sense of self that's larger than any single emotion. You can feel devastated while still being someone who shows up, who loves, who contributes. You can feel afraid while still being someone who moves forward. You can feel grief while still being someone who's present to beauty and connection. The emotion and the response can coexist, and the response is where your freedom lives. Frankl also emphasized that this freedom carries responsibility. You cannot blame your circumstances for who you're becoming. You cannot say life made me bitter or my experiences made me this way, as if you had no part in it. Your circumstances contributed, certainly. They created challenges and pain. But your response to those circumstances, the person you're becoming through them, that's on you. This is simultaneously the most burdensome and most liberating truth of human existence. Burdensome because you can't avoid responsibility by pointing to your suffering and saying you had no choice. Liberating because it means that no matter what has happened to you or is happening to you, you retain agency over the most important thing, who you are and who you're becoming. Living from this recognition means developing a practice of catching yourself in the old question and shifting to the new one. You notice yourself asking, "Why is this happening to me?" And you gently redirect, "It is happening. What now? How will I respond? What meaning can I create here?" This isn't easy at first. The why question is habitual, automatic. It feels necessary and important. But with practice, you can train yourself to recognize it as a dead end and pivot to the more productive question. Over time, this pivot becomes more natural, more immediate. Eventually, you might find yourself responding to difficulty with what now, almost automatically, bypassing the victimhood narrative entirely. This practice is especially crucial in moments of acute suffering. When something terrible happens, when you receive devastating news, when you experience profound loss, the automatic response is why? Why me? Why this? Why now? And in the immediate aftermath, you might need to sit with those questions to express the outrage and injustice you feel. That's human. That's normal. But at some point, probably sooner than you think, you need to shift to what now. Because staying in why keeps you stuck in the past and in victimhood. Moving to what now opens you to the future and to agency. It acknowledges reality as it is and asks what you'll do with that reality. It transforms you from someone to whom something terrible has happened into someone responding to something terrible. And that shift changes everything. The ultimate test of this perspective isn't whether it makes you feel better immediately. Sometimes it won't. Sometimes choosing to respond with dignity and meaning is harder in the short term than collapsing into victimhood and bitterness. The test is whether it allows you to maintain your humanity, your sense of purpose, your capacity for growth and connection, even in the face of difficulty. Can you suffer in a way that honors what you value most? Can you face loss while still loving? Can you endure hardship while still contributing? Can you carry pain while still being present to beauty? If you can, even imperfectly, even inconsistently, you're living from the freedom Frankl identified. You're demonstrating that circumstances don't have the final word about who you are. What Frankl discovered, and what countless people have confirmed since, is that this way of approaching suffering doesn't just make suffering more bearable. It transforms your entire relationship with existence. You become less fragile because your well-being doesn't depend entirely on circumstances being favorable. You become more resilient because you've discovered resources within yourself that external events can't touch. You become more authentically yourself because you're no longer just reacting to life, but actively choosing who you'll be in the face of whatever life brings. You become freer in the deepest sense of the word, not free from suffering. That's impossible, but free within suffering, free to respond rather than merely react, free to create meaning even when circumstances seem meaningless. 20 minutes to reshape how you see pain. We're at the end, but you're at the beginning. The beginning of living from this understanding rather than just knowing about it. The beginning of exercising the freedom you never lose. The beginning of responding to suffering by asking not why, but what now. This shift won't eliminate your pain, but it will transform your relationship to it. And in that transformation, you'll discover something profound. That you're more powerful than you knew, more free than you realized, more capable of bearing life's difficulties with meaning and dignity than you ever imagined. Not because circumstances are less difficult, but because you finally recognize the one thing that circumstances can never touch, your freedom to choose what it all means and who you'll become through it. That's the gift Frankl left us, born from the worst circumstances imaginable, but applicable to all suffering. Your pain is real. Your freedom to respond is equally real. What you do with that freedom determines whether suffering diminishes you or deepens you. Choose wisely, choose consciously, and discover that even in your darkest moments, you're never as powerless as you think.